All right, everybody. So welcome. I'm Whitney. I'm with Midtown Reader, and we are hosting Doug Alderson today. Um, Doug's here with us, and he's going to talk about his new book, America's Alligator, which is very exciting. We're really grateful to Doug for agreeing to do this virtual event. It's out of everyone's comfort zone, so it was very kind of him to be our guinea pig. So I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about Doug just to get started. He is an award-winning writer who's published numerous articles and 14 wide-ranging books about adventures in national parks, sea adventures, Florida's natural history, and Florida's cultural history as well. And he currently works as the Outreach and Advocacy Coordinator at the Apalachicola Riverkeeper. And he lives just south of Tallahassee out in the woods where he is joining us from right now. And so Doug's gonna talk about the book for about 20 minutes, show us some cool stuff. And then at the end, we're gonna have time for a Q&A. So if any of you guys have questions that you wanna ask Doug, if you go to the bottom of your screen where you see my face talking, you can click on a chat button and you can chat to me, Midtown Reader, the host, and I can see your questions. And then so after Doug's presentation, I will feed him all of your questions from the audience. So go ahead, Doug, show us what you got today.
Thank you. People often ask me why I wrote this book. It's been a long time coming because my family moved here when I was 11 in 1968 from Chicago. So there weren't too many alligators in Chicago. I don't remember seeing one at a zoo up there either. So come down here, of course, I found out later that like millions of others that come to Florida, they want to see an alligator. And back in 1968, you really couldn't see too many alligators in the wild except at the St. Mark's Refuge in Wakulla Springs in this area. And today, you can see alligators in about every river or stream and pond and lake in the area. And that's because they have really rebounded. And I've seen hundreds of alligators in a kayak. And I coordinated the state's paddling trails for many years, and I gave a presentation to different states, and one was in Washington State at an international conference. The number one question I received, and I gave several presentations over several days, was, what about the alligators? Are they dangerous? All these different questions. They were so worried about alligators, and yet if they came to Florida, they would want to see one right away. So it's kind of like this dual thing, a little bit of fear, and yet they want to see an alligator. And I've seen hundreds in a kayak, and I really have not had any problem with an alligator being aggressive. I've had alligators jump off the banks and splash me because they get startled and they feel safe in the water, and you can see their bubbles going down as they sink to the bottom. I've never had one come up and try to grab me or be aggressive in any manner. The wild alligators are probably safer than the more tame ones that might be around a fish camp that people feed them, and those are the ones that are often removed eventually because they can become dangerous. So I've been around alligators for most of my life and always been fascinated by them. As far as the cultural aspects, I kind of got inspired by collecting old Florida postcards and old Florida books. And so one of the books I brought here, so I have a pretty good collection of original books from Florida. If you can see this, it's called Florida, the Land of Enchantment, 1918. And this is written by Nevin Winter. And I've quoted from this book. So I like to quote from books that make observations at least a century ago and sometimes longer. This is one of the good ones I've often quoted from. And I have a pretty good collection of books now for many years. And so I don't have to go very far to find good source material. I really have to go to my different bookshelves. Florida postcards, I have many, and some of these started to intrigue me. Here's one. You can see that. These are, this one's from about 1908 or so, more than 100 years old. And it shows they basically had to take stuffed alligators and put them in an old car and pretend like they were driving the car. Those are the type of postcards I started seeing. There was kind of cartoon postcards, alligator lovers here. This is Welcome to Florida, about 1908. So this has been around a long time. The tourists and the alligators. The original tourists really came to Florida. The big wave was in the Victorian era, and they mostly came down from steamship and train to Jacksonville and St. Augustine. And most of them wanted to see an alligator, and some of them wanted to shoot alligators. But eventually, the alligator farms started popping up to give people a guaranteed alligator encounter at some kind of reptile park. They popped up in Florida in several places, then all over the Southeast, and then in other states. This is one from Los Angeles, California. It went on for several decades in Los Angeles. They had many different pools with different size alligators. And the funny thing about this was there was almost no regulation whatsoever. You could walk into a pool of alligators and just pick one up and pose for a picture. And not just the babies like this one, but ones that were 5 or 6 feet long at least. Pretty ironic. And in today's climate with lawyers and everything, I don't think this would happen today. This is from California. They would harness alligators for kids' rides. They put saddles on them, things that you wouldn't see today, obviously. Here's a Florida postcard riding an alligator. Looks like it's in the wild. Don't know if it's really alive or not, but some of the other ones were definitely alive at these attractions. Another thing I found were the portrait studios of the era, Victorian era. People wanted to pose with alligators, so they had a lot of stuffed alligators. So here's one from Miami. Seen the stuffed alligator with the woman picking coconuts here. And there's hundreds of different types of these type postcards where people want to pose for pictures. They'd make them into postcards, send them home. And if they want to pretend like they were hunting an alligator, they would often have a prop gun like this guy has. He's wrestling an alligator, it's stuffed. But these postcards were very common starting around 1906 or so until about 1920. And some of the classic postcards were these alligator border postcards. They did a whole series of Florida ones, highly prized by collectors with different Florida scenes in the middle, always bordered by 3 alligators. And then the book really goes into different attractions as well as how the Seminole alligator wrestling came about, which is a fascinating history. The Seminoles certainly knew about wrestling alligators in the wild as far as taking them back to their village, but not doing it for show. But really a couple non-Indians started the trend in South Florida in the 1890s and after, and eventually started these Indian villages for tourists and taught Seminoles to wrestle for show, and because it looked more authentic. And so they often made as much money in one show as they could make in a week. So those are some of the postcards. I'm going to read some of the first chapter of the book, and this gives you a start of basically with the Native Americans and how they viewed some of the alligators in the Southeast. So this is part of chapter 1. Imagine passing between carved alligators adorning the great wooden pillars of the Tucabachi Muskogee Creek ceremonial grounds of Alabama in June of 1790. The winding Tallapoosa River shines under the vast Milky Way as a throng of people gather for the alligator dance. Bright firelight shines on eager faces. Men and women pair up as an elder begins a syllabic chant. It is the last night of the green corn ceremony, and a 4-day fast is nearing an end. The people of Tucabachi are celebrating the coming new year, a time when the corn is ripening and they can once again eat the staple in its many forms. There is laughter as the chant quickens and the elder vigorously shakes a gourd rattle. Each couple spins together, arm in arm, mimicking the rolling of alligators feeding or in combat. Evidence shows that alligators were respected and revered among the South's Native American people for millennia. Huge earthen mounds in the shape of alligators were reported along the Gulf Coast, perhaps the largest being 600 feet long the southeast corner of Grand Lake, Louisiana. Other mounds yielded numerous alligator remains, the likely result of discarded bones and scutes from meals. But a burial mound near Sarasota, Florida, yielded a ceremonially interred alligator with grave goods, perhaps to ensure safe passage to the afterlife. Some early accounts observed that Native Americans in Louisiana wore alligator tooth necklaces because they believed they had healing powers. On a more practical level, Atacapa and Karankawa Indians in coastal Texas smeared their bodies with alligator fat, rendered from cooking to repel mosquitoes. Haven't tried that one yet. And so I go on to account the one about the pillars at the Tukabachi grounds is from the anthropologist John Swanton. And I'll show you this one photo. This is an artist rendering of the alligator ceremonial mask. Came from Key Marco, Florida in the 1890s, 1896 during an excavation. So the peat there basically preserved several wooden items. One of them was this ceremonial alligator mask. So the alligator was revered by Native Americans. They would hunt them, of course, eat them, use the hides. And when the alligator hide trade came out, of course, they hunted, especially the Seminoles, who used the hides for trade goods. Later in the book, I go into some really fun stuff as far as alligator movies, songs, some of the souvenirs. I'll show you some of the souvenirs, kind of a show and tell here. So let me do that. Besides the postcards, I started coming across the souvenirs from the Victorian era. Now some of these are hard to find, but this is one, I think I had a picture in the paper. This is a cane carved with an alligator, and sometimes they would have the wood itself carved with alligators. And this was mostly from Jacksonville, Florida. So Jacksonville, Florida, as I stated in the article, was kind of like Alligator Central as far as souvenirs during the Victorian era. And you could find these finely carved souvenirs. They would often carve alligator teeth as well and other items. You could also find things made of alligator hide. So I challenge all the women to, the next time they go out on the town when the pandemic is over, to use this as an accessory. This is an alligator purse, and it's pretty much guaranteed to be real alligator with the feet there. So most people would not be caught dead using this today, but this was a fairly common type of accessory. And today, though, alligator shoes are pretty popular. There are also belts. The Russians made saddles out of Louisiana alligator hide in the 1800s. Alligator leather was prized for many uses. That's one reason why their numbers plummeted after about 1900. They were harvested so much they were afraid they were going to go extinct because of that. A couple of other souvenirs from the Victorian era. This is these souvenirs were for people that had some wealth. Most of these early Florida tourists had some money to take these steamboats and trains down to Florida. This is a stein made in Germany for the Florida tourist trade, mostly around St. Augustine, Jacksonville area. Here's another stein from the era, made in Germany for the Florida trade. And you'll see different varieties of this stein. Sometimes they have an alligator handle, but they often have these motifs with alligators. So very finely made. They were not cheap then. They certainly aren't cheap now. But it just showed the type of tourists that would come to Florida. After this era passed, we got into a little more of the brass and the bronze age in the 20s and 30s. This is a thermometer made of, I believe, brass, probably from the 30s or late 20s. And then we get into more of the era when the automobile came and people came to Florida by the droves from different income levels, from fairly modest incomes, not just the rich people. They made mass-produced alligator souvenirs, mostly from Japan initially, and today mostly from China. And this is the type thing that was found basically the 60s and 70s. Little snow globe with an alligator. So some fun stuff. The modern souvenirs, I took some photos in different souvenir shops, but I didn't feel moved to buy any of them. I really like more of the old stuff. I like some of the funny stuff. This is from the 60s from Key West. And it basically says, send more people, more tourists. The last ones were delicious. So they had a lot of alligator humor like this. And I found different ones with different cities. So Key West really doesn't have, I don't think they have any alligators in Key West, but it didn't matter. People thought of Florida and they thought alligators were just everywhere. And so you'll find this souvenir, this magnet with different towns and cities on it. So that's a lot of fun there. I get into the movies, and my favorite one was a B movie that came out in 1959. And you can find this movie on the internet. And I'll read you a little bit about this B movie. It's the first science fiction alligator film. It's called The Alligator People. It was released in 1959 as a double bill with The Return of the Fly. So you can see this is a high quality film. The female star, Beverly Garland, had also been in Swamp Women, which was an earlier film that did have some alligators in the film, filmed in Louisiana. The male headliner was none other than Lon Chaney Jr., the original Wolfman and Mummy. In this B movie, he plays a drunk and lecherous hermit named Manon, who has a hook for a hand due to an alligator bite, kind of like the captain of the Captain Hook, basically, and there's different things. But this guy is on land, but he hates alligators because it took his hand. He vows revenge by shaking his hook at any alligator he sees, looking like a swamp version of Peter Pan's Captain Hook or Moby Dick's Captain Ahab. The premise of Alligator People centers on a miraculous medical breakthrough in which a doctor has developed a serum that allows humans to emulate some reptiles by regrowing damaged body parts. However, there is a terrible side effect. You can kind of guess what the side effect will be. The patients gradually take on reptilian qualities and grow alligator-like skin. The doctor believes the only antidote is radiation. This is the 50s, so everything was radiation. Massive doses, gamma rays from a cobalt bomb combined with high-intensity X-rays. The treatment goes haywire when Manon drunkenly storms into the room wielding a gun. After lots of flashing and smoke a la Frankenstein, the patient turns into an upright alligator with no tail, but still wearing pants. So this is my favorite press photo that came out of the day. This is I kind of given away the plot here a little bit, but it's basically his fiance finds him because of this experiment gone wrong. He turns basically into an alligator, except he has no tail. But I won't tell you the exact ending, but it doesn't end well. But this is an actual press photo that was released to promote the movie. And I'm pleased to say that you can find this movie today on YouTube free of charge, and that's where I saw it. I doubt if you can rent it. Maybe you could rent it, but you can see it free of charge on your computer tonight. Just plug in YouTube and plug in Alligator People movie. And some of my other favorites, this is the gator bait. This is in the exploitative era. Basically billed with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre type movies. And basically I love this half animal, all woman. So basically this was a former Playboy model, and now she's running around like Jane and Tarzan, but a little more revealing. And she's kind of a menace in the swamps of Louisiana. Later on, the sci-fi got a little more intense with alligators in the sewers of the big cities. That's kind of a wives' tale, urban myth type thing. But the alligators were in sewers, but they really didn't survive the winter. But in this case, it survived in Chicago. It fed on lab rats that were disposed, that had growth hormone. So when it grew to be about 35 feet tall, basically it escaped. And you can imagine what happened at that point. this is a local, has some local history. They filmed part of this at Wakulla Springs. Joe Panther. This is the press photo. Ricardo Montalban was the Seminole elder. And a few years ago, they showed this movie at Wakulla Springs, and the eyewitnesses told me that after a short period, they wished they could turn the movie off. Evidently, it's not really well done. And I'm not able to find this movie anywhere to see it. So anyhow, if you find that, let me know, and it might be interesting. But those are just some of the fun things. Also found some older documents. This is from Harper's Weekly, and so one of these, I think this one was in the newspaper, but it shows, this is from 1890, kind of the alligator tourist trade, basically the either stuffing alligators or selling alligators, baby alligators, to tourists, and thousands were sold. And the funniest story I found was that a fancy motel or hotel in Richmond, Virginia, people started bringing the alligators when they got too big and leaving them at the fountain in the atrium of this big hotel. So they kept these alligators there and basically the lobby of the motel, and they ran free. And every morning the bellhops would have to herd the alligators out of the motel and the library and so forth back into the pools in the atrium. And this is on their website. It's a confirmed story. So that's in the book too. Also, you may have seen this a year or so ago. Parade magazine in the Sunday paper had an article about presidential pets. And I was writing the book, and they had two presidents evidently had alligators in the White House. One was Herbert Hoover's son, and the other one, can't recall the name right now. But basically, I said, this is great. I'm going to cover this in the chapter, Alligators in the White House. And you'll have to read the book to find out if this was actually true or not. It took me on a long road. It made it very interesting to find out the actual truth to this matter. But there was kids' books, there were toys about these alligators in the White House. And this was publicized for many, many years. Since the 1880s for the earlier president. And this was John Quincy Adams. So I urge you, if you read the book, you'll find out if John Quincy Adams was given alligators by Lafayette from his tours to the United States, and he kept the alligators in the bathtub in the East Room of the White House. And that's the story from 1880 on up. And it's in many publications, and find out if that is true or not. I have just a couple minutes, and one of the other fascinating rabbit holes I went down, I found out many alligators were named Old Joe. For some reason, if you had a big alligator, people called them Old Joe. And if you had someone that was really known for wrestling or dealing with alligators, his nickname was always Alligator Joe. So somehow this Joe was always attached to an alligator or a person at some point. So I covered the Old Joe, Wakulla Springs, and then there was one called Old Joe at a lake near Ocala, Lake Weir. And because of this alligator, I found out that's one way they caught Ma Barker and her son in a big shootout in 1935, the last of the outlaws that were not captured, the big name outlaws. And because her son was shooting at this big alligator in the lake with a Tommy gun and was bragging about it in letters to his brother. And those letters were found in Chicago. They kind of traced it back to this lake, and within a week they found the hideout of Ma Barker and her son, and had about a 4-hour shootout. I interviewed the grandson of a man who witnessed the entire shootout. He hid behind a tree and described it. And the house is now in a county park on the lake. And you can visit that house today, the Ma Barker house. Just one of the many interesting trips I went down that I would never have dreamed of before I started writing this book. And so it's a very rich history, very colorful, and I'm glad the press basically gave me the opportunity to do this in color. since I have about 100 photos, vintage and otherwise, in the book. The last couple chapters deal with alligator myths. What is reality? What is a myth? Because a lot of people say that you have to run zigzag if an alligator chases you on land. Well, that's completely false. That just enables the alligator to run straight and to catch you quicker. So basically just run as fast as you can. The alligator can only do a short burst. Most likely you can outrun the alligator. Alligators climb. There's different facts I put in the last couple chapters. The last chapter is different places you can see alligators in the wild. Among them locally, of course, Wakulla Springs. I love going on the boat tour, Wakulla Springs, and seeing the different tourists from up north or from different countries. And when they spot the first alligator, there's this excitement. Oh my gosh, and the boat basically tilts as they run to the side, whatever that alligator's on, and they take photos. So they don't really want to swim with the alligator, but they would love to take pictures from the safety of that boat. And a lot of people think when they swim in that spring, there's some big fence underwater that keeps the alligators out. And they can be a little shocked when told, basically, there's no fence, there's just a buoy, a rope and a buoy across the top. So with that, I think we have some time for some questions. So Whitney, do you have any questions that came in?
Sure, yeah. So thanks so much, Doug. That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. And I appreciate the few of us at the top who have our video on, because I know that as a speaker, it's hard if you're not getting any facial feedback to just talk to a lot of people. So thank you guys. I just wanted to let everyone know, in case you have to leave early, you can order the book from Midtown Reader either by calling us or on our website. And we've got a link directly to Doug's book in both the Facebook event and on our website events page. And so we got a question via email before the event, actually. So this reader loved the book. She thought it was very comprehensive, but afterwards she was wondering why you didn't include any alligator deaths in your book, like the one at Disney or the one at Wakulla.
Yeah, so the book is really about the popular culture in the alligator, and I really didn't go into this sensational type thing of the alligator attacks. So we do have alligator attacks. They're pretty rare, but that didn't really fit with the theme of the book. There are some books written just about attacks of certain animals. So there's an entire book written about alligator attacks, a book written about bear attacks and things like that. So it was pretty clear I didn't want to include that, and the press really didn't want to include that as well. But it does have, alligators can be dangerous. I have a lot of respect for them. I'm not saying that you can go out and hug an alligator today, but I haven't had any aggressive alligators, fortunately, from the vantage point of a kayak. I don't like to swim at night with alligators, so that's something I do.
Fair, cool. Well, I was wondering, reading about kind of all the different books you've written and all the things you've done in your career, I feel like you have a lot of conservationist in your background, but you're also, like with this book, you're very much fascinated with Florida culture and tourism and how everything's kind of changed since like car travel and the Industrial Revolution. So I wonder if you could talk about having kind of both of those perspectives in your work.
Yeah, I do like to explore the history and cultural history. So let's say I'm kayaking down a river. A lot of people don't realize that there was a town on the left and it's just woods now. There was logging going on. There was different activities. It may have been an Indian village. And so I like to research what was there. And it makes it a richer experience for me. And I often share that with other people as well. The same cultural history is the same way. To get the background of the alligator, its biology is interesting to me, but the culture is very colorful. And so I enjoy that. And you can see by some of the things I've shown you, it's pretty humorous as well. The different viewpoints people have and the renderings through the decades of things, something like the alligator. And so in Florida, that's probably the animal that's probably featured the most that I could find for the last 150 years or so. So to me, it just rounds out my experience a little more. So I love the outdoors, and that just brings in new perspectives.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. So let's see, that same person who sent in that other question, she was wondering about, are there Are there crocodiles in Florida, or is there anything about crocodiles in your research?
Yeah, there are crocodiles. I mentioned that, I believe, near the end of the book, but it's the American crocodile. It's mostly around Florida Bay, Key Largo, in that area. They do tolerate salt water. They tend to be pretty shy. It's not easy to see a crocodile in Florida. They're basically non-aggressive. I do have one photo of a crocodile with a guy named Alligator Joe, who messed with both crocodiles and alligators down in South Florida. He had one of the first attractions and basically was the first alligator wrestler in the 1890s. So I have a photo of him with a crocodile and a wheelbarrow, you'll see in the book. And so the crocodile is different because it has that longer snout and has different teeth that are exposed when the snout is closed, when the mouth is closed. They tend to be a little bit bigger. They're not really the aggressive type like you might hear about the Nile crocodile or some crocodiles in other countries. Fairly shy, basically.
Super interesting.
Most alligators are freshwater. You see them in brackish water. Sometimes at the mouth of a river, there's enough fresh water flowing out for them to hang out at the mouth of a river at the Gulf of Mexico.
So I'm sure a lot of folks who are here right now have been to Wakulla Springs. I know you've been all over Florida. Is there any other place like Wakulla that's really cool to see alligators?
Depends if you want to see in the wild. In the wild, you could see some of the Wasissa River just east of town. If you went into a kayak or a canoe or a boat, you could see several along the river. They're pretty used to people. They don't always tend to dive. So just I always keep my distance. I take a lot of photos, so I have a zoom lens. And I stay at least 20 or 30 feet away, sometimes more. So that's a good place to see around this area. The Wasissa is very accessible. The Wakulla River, you might see some. Certainly at Wakulla Springs, you'll see some. Just about any river, you'll see alligators. I've seen some in South Florida on places like Myakka State Park. Oh my gosh, you'll see there are thousands of alligators that live in Myakka River State Park. You have two lakes with a river connecting the lakes, and they kind of migrate from one lake to the other depending on the season. And they've counted thousands in that park. So you're guaranteed to see alligators in that park if you take a boat ride on one of the lakes, the upper lake. And as far as captive alligators, there's two main attractions. The St. Augustine Alligator Farm that started in 1893. It's still going strong. In St. Augustine, you'll see alligators from around the world, different crocodilian species. There's only one other species of alligator, that's from China. And that's more skinnier and more narrow snout, looks different. The rest are basically a type of crocodile or caiman. And the gator land in Kissimmee started in the 1940s, and that's going really well. All the alligator attractions in Florida the people I talk to, they're going very well. There's still people that want to see alligators and see different alligator shows of different types. So those are places you can see them in captivity. But really, just about any Florida river, you can see alligators. Most lakes.
We had a question come in. Do you have any experience at Paynes Prairie in Gainesville? They've noticed a decline in the population. Do you know anything about that area?
I don't know if they've had a decline. I'd have to talk to the biologist there. They may have appeared to have declined because they usually hang out at a sinkhole there. That's where they congregate. But now Paynes Prairie is kind of like a lake. After the hurricane a couple years ago, I think it was Ivan, that dumped so much water, Paynes Prairie is wet everywhere. And so alligators have spread out to cover, go throughout the prairie. So they're not concentrated anymore in certain areas. So that may be one reason why you don't see as many in Paynes Prairie. They're covering thousands of acres instead of just congregated in the sinkhole and some of the canals there.
It's wild. Let's see. Any record sizes of alligators that you found in your research?
Well, the old Joe in Lake Weir that the Barkers shot at, they didn't kill old Joe. Old Joe lived another almost 20 more years, and he was killed by an alligator hunter. When he was killed, he was over 15 feet long, about 15 and a half feet long. And that's about as big as they get. I've never seen an alligator probably that's over 13 or 14 feet in the wild. and they will cause you to kind of step back or paddle back or whatever. And they're about as long as your kayak, then you kind of take a double take. But that's pretty rare. But this guy, Old Joe, if you go to a restaurant in Lake Weir that's been there since the 20s, you'll see Old Joe's foot behind glass with a sign describing Old Joe and the Barkers and so forth. So I have a picture in the book about, they took one of Old Joe's remaining feet. It was a three-legged alligator. That's why he was known. And I guess they cut off one of his other feet for the restaurant.
Oh. Poor Joe.
Yeah, poor Joe. But he lived to be, that alligator probably lived to be, they mostly lived to be about 50 to 70 years. That alligator, because of his size, probably lived to be 80 or 90 years old, I'm guessing. So their lifespan is a little bit like humans, but occasionally they can live to be 80, 90 years old. I'm not sure about 100 or not.
And we got one more question. Somebody's wondering, what are some of your favorite old Florida books? So I don't know if they mean books that are in print about old Florida or old books about Florida.
Yeah, good question. I showed you one.
Yeah.
I have some books from the 1800s. They're mostly written for the tourists that came down the East Coast, St. Augustine and so forth. Sidney Lanier, the poet from Georgia, I have one of his books from the 1870s, I believe. He came to Florida. So he was very poetic in his description of Florida. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived in Florida in the St. Johns River. So she wrote pretty extensively about Florida, and so I like her writings. I love Marjorie Kinner Rawlings. She mostly wrote fiction, but she was a great writer, and she moved into Cross Creek. And she has a chapter about alligators and rattlesnakes, which I found interesting. Those are just a few of the ones, but some of these books are pretty funny. I got tired of the ones that just go into the hunting, because in the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of these books, especially the kids' adventure books, they would shoot about everything they would see. So that got a little tiresome. They just didn't have the conservation ethic. When you get into about 1910 to 1920, suddenly some authors are realizing that species are disappearing. So suddenly their tone changes from shooting things to wanting to conserve them and protect them. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to see that change in the writing. So everybody wanted to see an alligator in the wild, and yet a lot of people wanted to shoot them. There was no laws against that, and so their numbers started to plummet. And suddenly people said, we got to do something and protect these animals, otherwise they would be extinct.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Doug. I think it's about the time we said we were going to wrap up. So thank you guys all for coming. If you want to give us a call at the store or order Doug's book online, we're going to get in as many copies as we can. So we're really excited to have it on the shelf. And we really appreciate you, Doug. And hopefully we can set up some kind of book signing one of these days.
It would be great to see everybody in person. So this is the first for me, the Zoom author meet and greet. So I hope I entertained you a bit. It was a lot of fun for me to gather up everything around me like this. And, and if you want to tune into a longer program, I'm doing May 12th, a Zoom program for the Florida Trail Association. They lined me up to speak, and they asked me if I wanted to do a Zoom. I said, sure, I'll do a PowerPoint. So I'm going to do more than half an hour, maybe more of a PowerPoint. You'll see a lot of the photos from the book and maybe some more.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Doug, and thank you all you Midtown readers. See you soon.
Stay safe, everybody.
Yeah, join us tomorrow for Diane Roberts.
She'll be fun.
In place. Oh yeah, it'll be fun. Yes. See you guys later. Bye.
Bye-bye.